Hi, howdy, how you doing? This is the third chapter in the Teach Us Dr. Hirsch lecture, VTuber, super spectacle bonanza, and we're getting into chapter 3, which is the physical biology of the brain, or biological psychology. So I'm going to be very honest on the upfront because I'm not actually teaching, and no one is supervising me, and I can say what I want because you all don't get to evaluate me at the end of the semester. So, between you and me, this is probably my least favorite chapter to teach. Like, it's fine. I don't hate it. It just ends up being very didactic. So I'm going to kind of just be throwing a lot of information at y'all. Because it turns out that the brain is very complicated. When it comes down between neurotransmitters to neurotransmission to all kinds of the physical processes of the brain, there's a lot going on there and there's a lot to talk about and to try to cram into one video here. I'm going to do my best here, but this is going to be a crash course kind of thing. But there is going to be some fun stuff. I'm going to try to make this as amusing as I possibly can. But just so you all know, this is the only psychology course I have ever gotten a B in. I was not good at physical biology or at psychobiology. But without further ado, let us get into it. All right. So the overarching theme here, I know I got a B once. Can you believe it? And they still let me be a doctor. So if you ever get a B, it's fine. The fun thing, actually, is that once you get to grad school, you're supposed to get Bs. And if you start getting too many As, you might get a talking to because you're putting too much time into your coursework. It's like a very weird inversion where suddenly getting A's is bad. Whatever. All right. So your brain and you, like I said, this is going to be a crash course. And by crash course, I mean like in the next hour and a half, I'm going to throw a lot of information at you. And you don't have to retain all of it, but it's important to kind of get a general feel for how things work because the underlying physicality of the brain and how neurotransmission and to familiarize yourself with different neurotransmitters. It's just like to really get the verbiage and get the idea for how all this stuff works. When we talk about stuff like developmental psychology or even social psychology, when we talk about sense and perception, it's going to like when I say occipital lobe next time when we talk about sense and perception, it's more that you want to know that that has something to do with the eye. Occipital, eye, it's fine. All right. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about the very fundamental element of memory and transmission in the brain. We're going to talk about communication. We're going to talk about the differences between the central and peripheral nervous system. We're going to talk about the endocrine system and glands and hormones. Got a lot to say about that. That should be pretty fun. And we're going to talk about different evolutionary ways, or I guess the not so much evolutionary in a biological sense, but in a sort of mechanistic sense, different progress in how we have come to understand the function of the brain, what it does, what it's good for, and how we visualize different neural activity, and also some of the current drawbacks and controversies around the science of neuroimaging. So, what does the brain do? This is a very important question. It's basically it's haunted people since they knew that they had brains to begin with. So, the one definition that I really like, especially in the context of a course like this, which is probably an intro psychology course, let's just call it that. The mind is what the brain does. What we experience is cognition, whether it's our sensations, perceptions, our thoughts, our memories, etc. All of those are implicated back to the mechanistic processes that underlie those, or the mechanistic activities in the brain. When one neuron fires and another neuron receives it, that more or less can make up the sum of our whole human experience, whether that's our self-perceptions, our perceptions of the world around us, how we interact with each other, etc., etc., etc. Who we are and what the mind is all underlined by what we're going to learn about in the next 90 minutes or so. But that was not always the case. Turns out the history of, I guess we call psychobiology, is a contentious one. So way back when in ancient Egypt, they genuinely believed that the brain did nothing. In ancient Greek, they thought that it maybe did some kind of something. Maybe it was some kind of like a radiator, and like we use it to vent heat, which some kind of makes sense intuitively, right? It's in our head, it's on top of our body when we're upright. So the idea that it's some way of like ventilating or conditioning ourselves in terms of just temperature, kind of, you can see how someone could intuitively come to that conclusion, right? But more commonly, historically, especially among the Greeks and Egyptians, the belief was more so that it was the heart that was like the core nervous system of the body, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because when you get excited, your heart beats faster. When you're calm, your heart beats slower. And so there was an immediate physical feedback to how your brain, like what we now know as neural activity, that is felt more clearly in the heart. But as we know, correlation does not equal causation, and we've thankfully moved beyond some of these models here. Yeah, that's actually an interesting correlation. The idea of like the image of smoke coming out of someone's ears kind of falls into the same idea of it being a radiator. So what actually goes on inside the brain? Well, turns out you have a lot of things called neurons. You might be familiar with them. If you weren't already, you're going to be very familiar with them by the time we finish this talk. Oh, Tom, you have an emote of smoke coming out your ear holes. So actually, in fact, you're in line with the Greek model of the brain as a radiator. Although, do you even have a brain if you're a skeleton? All right. Neurons. They are nerve cells, not the only kinds of nerve cells, but nerve cells that are specialized in communication. So they're not only found in the brain, they're not the only cells found in the brain, but they are critical in the function of the brain and all of our underlying neural activity. And we have billions of neurons in the brain. Most people have about 85 billion neurons stewing about in there, shooting off messages to each other, and generally underlying and controlling everything that we do. And altogether, those 85 billion neurons make something like 160 trillion connections in the average human adult. That's a lot. It's still fewer than the number of followers that I have on all of my social medias, but you know, it's a good number. Now, in addition to neurons, we also have glial cells. Glial cells is a broad umbrella term, but generally you can think about them kind of like custodians of the brain, whereas neurons are churning away, sending messages, receiving messages, and doing all the little things that neurons do. Glial cells fill in with all the other different functions. They're in charge of creating the myelin sheath, which we'll talk about later. They promote new connections between neurons, heal damaged cells, prune dead neurons, hold neurons in place, literally helping us form the structure of the brain and supply nutrients to neurons. So when I say that neurons are specialized cells, they are extraordinarily specialized insofar as they basically can't even take care of themselves. They require the support network of glial cells to maintain their function and even the physical structure of the brain. So you might have heard this term about neurons firing. So what does that actually mean? And like what does it actually look like when a neuron fires? So let's break this one down. Again, this is the most important thing to understand, probably, of underlying this entire chapter and everything that you're going to learn here. How does a neuron work? So a neuron, let's say you've got neuron A. Neuron A responds to neurotransmitters released by neuron B. And those different neurotransmitters, which are chemicals that are shared between neurons to exchange signals, can either be excitatory, aka they get that neuron A, the receiving neuron, pumped up, making it more likely to fire, or they can be inhibitory and they prevent that neuron from firing or reduce its charge, really just telling it to chill. And if a cumulative charge from all the messages that neuron is receiving exceeds a threshold, the neuron fires in what we call an action potential. So if we were to say, let's make it VTubers, right? It's kind of like an overarching theme of this. So let's say that neuron A is a VTuber and they are deciding if they're going to do a gorilla stream that day. And then there are a whole bunch of other neurons that are either saying, yes, you should totally do that, or no, you should not do that. So all those cumulative messages are all coming into the first neuron, neuron A. But once they reach a certain level of enablement, they will go and do the stream, order the lewd skeb, do whatever it is that they were waiting to do. Yeah. Yeah, it's a relatable experience, right? So what does it actually look like in terms of a visual? So this is a neuron. This is what they look like. Our brains are full of them. Except mine, I made a Photoshop layers. So what does it actually look like? So we have the cell body and the dendrites. These are basically the receptive channels. And so for each dendrite, it is connected to the terminal branches of axon that are connected to other neurons. So what happens is dendrites receive messages that are then processed in the cell body. Once the cumulative excitement reaches a certain threshold, the neuron fires or it depolarizes, changing its electrical charge, causing a current of electricity to travel down the axon to the terminal branches of this neuron, where it then passes on the message through its own terminal branches into another neuron. This is what's happening all over your brain, all the time, every minute, every moment of every day. Neurons are firing, they are exciting each other, they are telling each other to chill, and that is what really makes up you as you. It's the culmination of these excitatory and inhibitory impulses. So this is what we call an action potential when a neuron fires. So if you want to think about this in terms of electrical current, so a resting potential, so without any other input, a neuron is resting at a negative charge of about 70, it's about 70 millivolts. So as that neuron increases, what ends up happening, it receives excitatory impulses until it reaches a certain charge of about negative 55 millivolts. When that threshold is passed, depolarization occurs. The membrane of the neuron opens up, it becomes porous, allowing positively charged ions that are surrounding it to pour into the neuron, which then trigger this electrical impulse to travel down the axon into the terminal branches and what we call depolarization. And then it repolarizes back to its resting impulse into what we call a refractory period. Much like the other refractory period after orgasm, where people cannot orgasm again, it's literally the same thing. So once a neuron has been depolarized, there is a short period of time where it cannot fire again. So no matter how much you stimulate a neuron after it has fired, it has to go through this refractory period. And in fact, during repolarization, neurons overshoot slightly, as you can see by that little dip, and then go back to the action potential 90%. Go back to the resting negative 70. Again, what happens, so it depolarizes, it repolarizes, and then as that transmission hits the terminal branches, a neuron releases synaptic vesicles, which are basically water balloons full of different neurotransmitters, into the synapse, which is the gap between the neural branch, between the gap between different neurons. So a neural impulse hits the axon terminal. It simulates a synaptic vessel to move to the end of the axon, where the water balloon pops, dumping all these delicious neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap, where they then will travel to the other neuron and they will bind to different receptor sites. So let's say, for example, you've probably heard the term dopamine before. Maybe dopamine is what's released. It dumps into the synapse. It binds to dopamine receptor sites on the other neuron, and it can either cause an excitatory or inhibitory effect in the other neuron. And then those neurotransmitters are pulled back up into the first neuron in a process called reuptake. So you may have actually heard about, and I'll talk about them in more details, but when we talk about something like SSRIs or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, this is the process that we're talking about, reuptake inhibitor. It's supposed to prevent the reuptake or slow down the reuptake of serotonin in the synapse after transmission. Let's talk about a couple of neurotransmitters and how they work. So one of the most important ones here is GABA. GABA is almost exclusively going to be inhibitory. It's actually present in several anti-anxiety drugs. In fact, a lot of psychoactive drugs that we take, like anti-anxiety drugs, like I talked about, reuptake inhibitors, etc., act on the brain by influencing different neurological processes. And it's like usually via changing the amount, either increasing or decreasing the amount of certain neurotransmitters present in the brain at any given time. So when we think about anxiety, anxiety tends to be about something about the presence of neural activity, or maybe of excessive neural activity. That can be a root cause of anxiety. So GABA, as an inhibitory neurotransmitter that reduces the activity in the neurons that are receiving it, one way of approaching that might be giving someone a medication that either increases the amount of GABA that's being transmitted by neurons, or causing more GABA to linger in the synapse, causing inhibition of the various neurons that are in the brain, or maybe around certain channels. And it's like, and here, maybe even as a downstream consequence, reducing anxiety. Dopamine, also known as dopamine, get it? I'm very funny. I'm the funniest doctor you've ever watched on YouTube, right? Right? Number one, Ichiban. Anyway, so dopamine is a funny one, right? So dopamine is basically, it does everything. Like, that's kind of the long short of dopamine. It does basically everything. And so when someone says that, like, whenever anything happens, usually in a neurological case or a neurological abnormality, usually dopamine is implicated at some level or in some way, because it's just all over the place. And importantly, this highlights how the different type of receptor site can massively change what that neurotransmitter is doing. Now, one big thing that comes up around conversations in dopamine is about how its role in reward. So, fun thing here. You ever heard about a drug named cocaine? So cocaine hits the brain and approximates and binds to dopamine receptors, which is why it feels good. It basically floods the brain with a synthetic or approximation of dopamine, or maybe in some cases, or other types of drugs, might increase the amount of dopamine reduced in implicated or transmitted in the brain, and they feel good. It's a rewarding sensation, right? And so this is one of the reasons that we can explain addiction and cycles of addiction, because a lot of the more addictive brain chemicals or psychoactive drugs that people take might have some role in increasing the amount of dopamine in the brain. But highlighting its multiplicative properties, if you've ever seen the movie Awakenings with Robin Williams, I want to say it's Robin Williams. In that film, Awakenings, Robin Williams is a psychologist working with catatonic schizophrenic patients, and he discovers that giving them large amounts of synthetic dopamine in the film called L-Dopa relieves their symptoms. So since they're catatonic schizophrenics, they're not exhibiting sort of delusions or odd behaviors. Rather, the opposite. It's a reduction of behavior. They don't move. It's as if they're in a catatonic state. But by giving them more dopamine in the brain, it allows them to function more normally. That's based on a true story, if I recall correctly. Now, serotonin is a typically inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's linked like dopamine to a lot of things, whether it's mood regulation, like attentional regulation, aggression regulation, and it's typically found, like I specifically noticed it in SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. A lot of antidepressants will operate by increasing the amount of serotonin present in the brain. Also, endorphins, this is a weird one. Technically, they're a neuropeptide, but they operate under a lot of the same, I guess, psychophysiology. And how endorphins tend to be inhibitory, in particular, when we hear about stuff like adrenaline, for example, operates as an endorphin, or endorphins being released in the brain. They tend to be released maybe in reduction to pain or associated with a sense of euphoria, which is where we get stuff like codeine, morphine, and heroin. Opiates and barbiturates tend to operate similarly to or increase the amount of endorphins in the brain. So these are it's a very short overview. And a lot of these are going to come up later. So this is more of a, if you're going along with this as a course, just try to familiarize yourself with some of the terms here and more generally what they're implicated with, because there's going to be all kinds of exceptions, but just kind of know like that's serotonin. Serotonin generally is implicated in stuff like mood and regulation. Dopamine basically does everything, but is principally implicated with reward, so on and so forth and so forth. So, like I was saying with psychoactive drugs, a lot of the medications that we take, like Wellbutrin, as an antidepressant, trying to think of things off the top of my head. Let's see, Wellbutrin, Adderall's a stimulant. Let's see. Zoloft, various SSRIs, and different medications that you've heard of generally operate by either increasing or decreasing the amount of neurotransmitter activity in the brain, either as an agonist, aka something that is increasing, or an antagonist, something that is decreasing activity. And this is not the same as a psychedelic drug. We'll talk about those later with sensation and perception. But when we say psychoactive, what we generally mean is active within the brain. It is something that happens, or something that a drug that someone takes that either will increase or decrease the presence of certain neurotransmitters in the brain. Yeah, there's an easy joke. Like, there was an easy joke about protagonists on this slide. I took it out. Here. It seemed like it was too low, like the fruit was too low hanging. I had to pass it up for a bit. I had to exercise some self-control, release some serotonin into my brain. And so, this brings us to a very interesting topic. Neuroplasticity. This is a topic that blew my mind when I took intro psych, because I grew up believing that the number of neurons you have is the number of neurons you will always have, or the moment that you're born, or the same you'll always have. And that is not true. Because our brains are changing over time, mostly during childhood, but really throughout our entire life cycles. And that at different junctions, we might have more prolific growth, we might have die-offs, but in general, our brains are never fixed. And part of that is because even the same two neurons, or the same neuron throughout its life cycle, is going to change and grow and develop. It's going to build new connections. It's going to build new dendrites. Remember, those are the receptor sites. It's going to build new axons. Remember, the transmission sites. So all over our brains, our cells are growing and shifting and changing. Whenever you learn something, we'll talk about this a little bit later, you are physically changing the structure of your brain as your brain is creating new synapses, new dendrites, new axons. Your brain is physically changing as you are listening to me and you are building new memories. I am literally changing your brain with the power of VTubing. How sick is that? Yep, learning the Iron Man Infinite does in fact change you for life. Light punch, heavy punch. So, I am, that is my true superpower. I'm actually a hypnotist VTuber. So, when we talk about stuff like growing new axons and new dendrites, we're talking about a process called synaptogenesis. And now, in contrast, about 70% of all of our neurons die off during the course of our lifetime. So, when you hear about people, you're born with an X number of neurons as a child, and that's the whole number you're always going to have, that is not true, because a lot of them are going to die anyway over time. But because of the process of synaptogenesis, even if neurons are dying, that doesn't mean that you have fewer net connections in your brain. How cool is that, right? So neurons can die, but it's possible for other neurons to take over those channels of communication and functions. And we'll talk about some of that a little bit later. So in response to something like, let's say, for example, a blind person learning to read Braille. So what we know about people who become blind later in life that learn to read Braille is that some of the neural pathways and neural circuitry that was charged with interpreting signals from the eyes, like portions of the occipital lobe, will actually rewire and rework themselves and become active while the person is reading Braille. Once again, how sick is that? That even as someone could experience a catastrophic injury later in life, their brain has the power and ability to physically change and adapt in response to that kind of information. And this happens again after injuries. Maybe you experience a concussion, which can cause some death of neural function. But you can recover from a concussion, right? Even in a severe concussion. And a big underlying part of that is your brain's ability to create new channels of communication later in life to compensate for potential neural die-off in response to an injury. And also, like I said before, this is what is saying, what is happening when you are learning. When you learn, you are building new synapses in the brain. It's also what happens when you build new memories. The new connections are made in the brain in response to those memories, physically changing it. Oh, it's really cool. Our brains are wild and incredibly fascinating things. Yep. So Brent's saying that it's why they say it's like if you lose your sense, other senses are enhanced. Yeah, in part because those neurons. Let's say, for example, you become deaf. Let's say something happens that physically damages your ears, and all of a sudden, the neurons that were in charge of transmitting and interpreting signals that were coming from maybe the cochlea in your ear are no longer receiving that information. Those neurons can repurpose and recharge themselves to take on other functions. Fucking sick. So what does the brain behavior network look like? Moving on. So we're going to talk a little bit now about the difference between the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system, which we're going to be talking about a little bit later with the somatic, automatic, sympathetic, and parasympathetic nervous systems. But let's get started with the brain and the spinal cord. So again, I want to stress that this is a crash course. There's going to be a lot of information here. And like I said up front, I got a B in this class as well. So I'm going to go through, there's going to be a lot of stuff here, but for the purposes of this like sort of YouTube lecture series, Twitch lecture series, don't beat yourself up if you have to go back or if you have to review something or it doesn't all click at the first time. It didn't click for me the first time, and I'm literally a doctor. All right. That's a cool Civ 5 quote. If the brain were so simple we could understand it, we wouldn't be so simple. We wouldn't be so simple that we couldn't. It's fascinating. I haven't played Civ 5, but that's a good quote. So, brain behavior, central nervous system, you got the brain, you got the spinal cord. Typically, this is what we think about in terms of the centralized pathways wherein we receive sensory information and use that to make decisions. And the peripheral nervous system is literally all the other nerves that connect our body to the central nervous system. We have somatic systems, which are our voluntary movement, and we have automatic systems, which cover non-voluntary functions. Stuff like our fight or flight response, aka the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, stuff like regulating your heartbeat or breathing, are usually automatic functions, although if I were to say something like, you are now breathing manually, you might find that some of these functions are not purely automatic and that you can actually influence them and they can become partially somatic if need be. A lot of stuff we're going to go over here. We're going to talk about the cerebral cortex. We're going to talk about the basal ganglia, the limbic system, the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. So in this case, this is kind of being presented in descending order of complexity and also what we now understand as evolutionary order. So this is what generally a person's brain would look like if you could specifically look at X-ray glasses that only highlighted neurons. So we have the brainstem, cerebellum, thalamus, hypothalamus, corpus callosum, and forebrain. This is what we consider the reptilian brain or the lizard brain. This is what we consider to be a early evolutionary development. And it's like, in fact, the reason that we call it a reptile or lizard brain is because these structures in the brain tend to appear in most vertebrates. So we have a brainstem that tends to focus on the control of involuntary functions like our heart rate and breathing. Our cerebellum, which tends to regulate our balance and bodily control. The thalamus, which is a relay center within the brain. Our hypothalamus, which tends to have a big control in, or a bigger role in the endocrine or hormone systems of the brain or hormone production. You might remember the movie Osmosis Jones. The final showdown takes place in the hypothalamus. Corpus callosum, which is a bundle of nerve fibers that connect the two brain hemispheres. We will talk about that one later. And more broadly, the forebrain, which we'll talk about when we get to the cerebellum. Or we get to the cortex, not the cerebellum. So like I said, typically the brainstem and cerebellum are talked about as the lizard brain, and what beautiful and wonderful lizards they are. So what actually makes up the brainstem and cerebellum? The midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. The midbrain, again, we see as sort of, which also we consider as being part of our ability to move, track visual stimuli in our response to our auditory information that we receive. Again, the pons is a relay center between the cortex and the cerebellum. Again, cortex, we'll talk about later, is implicated with a lot of more higher brain function. The medulla, which is in charge of breathing and heartbeat. The medulla, also known as the brainstem. And the cerebellum, which is chiefly in charge of balance and coordinating movement. So basically, when we think about a lot of this, we're really looking at, again, very baseline functions. A lot of this would be for the hunter-gatherer that we ultimately evolved into. This is largely very basic evolutionary function to be able to secure food, to regulate breathing and heart rate, to balance, to explore in an environment, and so on and so forth. So what does it look like? Basically this. Again, this is sort of some fun, if not, maybe not entirely helpful graphs, but just to kind of situate that these are sort of the baseline evolutionary structures of the brain, and then a lot of what else we think about as the brain, aka the cortex, grows out from this in increasingly non-essential ways. So in the next section here, let's talk about the limbic system. Again, is going to be sort of another step up. This is what we consider to be sort of the emotional center of the brain, although it does still have a role in sense and perception. We have the thalamus, which is an information relay from our sense organs to our primary sense cortex. So this is the thalamus is going to help relay signals from, say, our eyes to the occipital lobe, or from our ears to the auditory lobe, and so on and so forth. The hypothalamus, which regulates a lot of our internal body states. Again, like I said, Osmosis Jones, you might remember that the virus or villain in Osmosis Jones is trying to sabotage the hypothalamus, which will kill the person whose body the film takes place in. And it deals a lot with, again, regulating different controls, which makes sense because it controls the pituitary gland, which is very heavily implicated in the endocrine system, as well as regulating a lot of our bodily functions. The amygdala is frequently talked about as the emotional center of the brain, and it plays a key role in fear, excitement, as well as arousal. And the hippocampus is very well implicated. We'll talk about this a lot when we get to memory as a chapter, but in terms of spatial memory and our ability to transfer information from our short-term memory to long-term memory. And so in some cases where people experience damage to the hippocampus, whether that's from oxygen deprivation, accident, so on and so forth, people that experience traumatic damage to the hippocampus sometimes find that they are no longer able to form new memories. Like, there's some pretty fascinating case studies we'll talk about in that chapter of people who find themselves maybe on the date of a car accident where their hypothalamus was damaged, that as much as time goes on, they find themselves trapped in time, unable to form new long-term memories. And so maybe it's the year 2003, their accident happened in 1990, their long-term memory is fixed at that point. It's going to be a very sad but very interesting discussion. And this is what the limbic system generally looks like again. Yep, actually, I want to say, isn't that explicitly the plot of 50 First Dates? Is that her hypothalamus has been or her hippocampus has been damaged, and so she's unable to make new long-term memories? I want to say that's actually explicitly the plot, and they do, and they name drop the hypothalamus in there. Yep, and that is based on real case studies. There are people that have had damage to the hypothalamus or hippocampus, and been unable to form new long-term memories for the rest of their lives. All right. Moving into the, again, limbic system, this is what it looks like in terms of where everything falls in the brain. All right. The basal ganglia, this is my effort to always have a horse in every talk that I give from now on. Putting the cart before the horse, get it? Because it has implication for reward. Ha 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 ha. And very funny. The basal ganglia being still part of the midbrain, which again, we think about it sort of being a middle evolutionary portion of the brain. Does a lot to control our controlled movement. So we think about stuff like the medulla controlling involuntary movement. The basal ganglia is going to be in charge of our controlled and deliberative movements. So the way that I am moving right now to make my VTuber act around is a very deliberative and controlled process that requires some higher level brain function. A lot of those neurons are located chiefly in the basal ganglia. Moving into the cortex. So this is where we get into a lot of higher brain function. We're talking about the frontal lobe, the central sulcus. I've never been able to pronounce that word correctly. Parietal lobe, occipital lobe, as well as the temporal lobe. So, like I've said before, and you've probably heard, the occipital lobe generally is implicated in processing visual information. The temporal lobe is one that is in charge of a lot of our autobiographical memory. It actually carries a lot of different functions, surprisingly. It deals a lot with how we process sound, but also it's implicated in a lot of our ability to understand and produce language. Now, there are some theorists that are, especially language theorists, that want to or would try to make an argument that it makes sense for language and autobiographical memory to be connected into the same points. That is to say that a lot of our autobiographical memory, aka our memories about ourselves, require language to really exist. After all, if we can't necessarily articulate or express in language what is happening to us as a form of narrative or story, then they would question whether or not that's really an autobiographical memory to begin with. The parietal lobe deals a lot with our information about touch, as well as integrating our vision and touch. So when we literally say stuff like hand-eye coordination, the parietal lobe is where a lot of that happens. And the frontal lobe and prefrontal cortex deal a lot with our planning, executive function, and coordinating other areas. Speaking of the frontal lobe, he's come up once. He's probably going to come up again. I actually know for certain he will come up again. Phineas Gage is a classic, maybe the classic case study in all of brain and behavior and a lot of psychology. Phineas Gage was a railway worker who, in response to a accident, as a direct result of an accident, had a tamping rod, which he's featured here with. He actually carried it with him for the rest of his life. Had a tamping rod blown through his skull. It went up through his eye socket, as you can see, where he has the damage to his eye, and blew out through the top of his skull, going directly through his frontal lobe. And miraculously, he lived. So in the last chapter, we talked about how case studies typically happen or are conducted when something so extreme happens that you could never ethically do it to a person. You never, ever, ever could ethically induce this kind of trauma to a single human being. And yet, it happened to Phineas Gage, and he happened to live. And he lived for many years afterwards. He did a lot of research. In fact, in a bit of morbid curiosity, his skull, he was actually beheaded after death. His body was buried separately from his head because it was considered, the damage to his brain was so important for our current understanding and at the time developing understanding of how the brain works and the connection between the brain and behavior. Because after this accident, Phineas wasn't necessarily ever the same person. People reported that he had a drastic change to his personality. He became irritable and short-tempered. Makes sense because we think about the frontal lobe as being implicated in a lot of planning and emotional regulation. A lot of that early research and early theorizing came from this accident with Phineas Gage. How about that, right? Taking a sippy. So before we get into the endocrine system, does anyone have any questions? I know I'm kind of rushing through here, but I want to take a second to catch up, make sure we're all on the same page, and so on and so forth. The endocrine system. Well, we're going to get into some fun stuff here. So the endocrine system is in charge of the glands that release hormones. So hormones are not necessarily neurotransmitters because rather than being transmitted between neurons, they are chemicals or molecules that will travel around the body and influence the functions of different organs, as well as emotions and stress, because hormones are all, the brain is an organ and it is not immune to the influence of different hormones. Now, they tend to be slower and longer lasting than most neurotransmitters. So when you think about a neurotransmitter, remember that water balloon metaphor I used earlier? That really is how it works. It's there in a moment and then it's gone. Whereas hormones tend to linger, they tend to remain in the blood and around our different parts of the body, continuing to influence the function of different organs for quite a while. And like with all good points in this lecture, there is a interaction then between organs and their function and how they're impacted by hormones and the function of the brain. In this case, it is the pituitary gland. So in the pituitary gland, we will see a lot of activity with the production and the release of hormones that can have a wide range of implications across the body, including controlling blood pressure, our growth, etc., etc., etc. You might have heard the pituitary gland. Yes, it does have an impact on puberty. It is also implicated with the hormone oxytocin. Now, the actual impact of oxytocin, what you may have heard about in some pop psych, massively overstated. But it is released in the brain in response to physical contact. So if you hug somebody, for example, if you cuddle with someone that you care about, when you talk, then oxytocin is released into the brain and into the body. It is sometimes in shorthand called the bonding hormone, in that higher levels of oxytocin are going to float around in the brain and are going to give a person sort of a euphoric effect. They improve mood. They're associated with the emotion that we call love, as well as our sense of affiliation with different people. So as we are physically around people, we have hormones that are released in our body that make us feel an emotional sensation that are in line with affiliation or connection with these people. Yep. Some people call it the cuddle hormone. Again, for a while, people were looking at this as if it was like the cure to antisocial activity, that you could give people a nasal spray, and that it would you'd shoot people up with this nasal spray, and it would make them super pro-social and cuddly and amazing and great. Turns out those are not necessarily true. Remember last week when I talked about effect size, or last lecture when I talked about effect sizes? Very true here. It turns out that, the cuddle hormone does not have as powerful as an effect as some early researchers tried to sell it as. And a lot of grant money was spent on researching it. Now, also part of the endocrine system is the adrenal glands, which produce adrenaline as well as cortisol in response to times of stress. So what's very interesting in speaking about the impact of hormones. Now, we've all probably heard about adrenaline. It rushes in the body, it boosts our energy, it gives us a lot, it kind of is associated with our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. But cortisol isn't discussed as often. Now, cortisol is sometimes talked about as a stress hormone. It is released in the body to regulate blood pressure, etc., in times of stress or physical activity. Now, it does last in the body a long time. In prolonged periods of chronic stress, you can actually see cortisol levels and trace them like rings in a tree in a person's hair. So if you were to pluck a strand of hair off my VTuber body, you would see that I am literally made of stress. And I actually, for a while, worked around a lab that principally looked at this in a developmental context, where they would look at a kid's hair and they would see the different trajectories and amounts and times that cortisol was present in their body, and then map that into into the experiences of stress at different points in development. It's actually like super cool. But when we talk about hormones, hormones are powerful shit. And they last for a very long time. Now, another fun thing here in terms of other stress hormones, we'll talk about on probably the next slide, if I recall correctly. Another hormone that is released in times of stress is testosterone, actually. And so when people experience pronounced periods of chronic stress, it actually increases testosterone production as well as cortisol production in the body. So if and when, for example, let's see, a person might be experiencing maybe a very stressful job, a stressful relationship, or anything, you might notice that some people talk about how they are so stressed that they are losing hair. Yeah, right. So this is also part of why people get white hairs, that it's changing the biochemical nature of the body that shows up in your hair. In the case of testosterone, it can cause people to lose their hair. So men or women that have very high levels of testosterone might start to experience hair loss earlier. Now, also, people that live with high levels of stress, chronic and prolonged stressors, also might experience hair loss because of the production of testosterone in their own bodies. How sick is that, right? Really not, but it's pretty fascinating to look at. So I learned this lesson not in a psychology course, but as most people know, and if you don't, this might come as a shock to you. I am trans. I am a transgender woman, and part of being on hormone replacement therapy is that I have gone through many months of having to take routine blood work to measure my blood levels of estrogen and testosterone, respectively. And now, after I finished my PhD, I had started hormone replacement shortly prior, and there was a negative trajectory of my testosterone over time because I was taking testosterone blockers, specifically spironolactone. Now, over time, after I graduated, my ex-fiance cheated on me and dumped me. I was struggling on the job market, I lost my insurance, and I was basically broke. As you can imagine, my stress levels were through the roof for many months there. And as a consequence, if you looked at my hormone panels, that downward trajectory actually reversed. My body started producing more testosterone, or showing more testosterone, than I did prior to starting hormone replacement, even though I was taking the highest dose of testosterone blockers that my doctor would prescribe. It's really wild how this shit works. Now, important to keep in mind, though, no matter what, as long as you have testes or ovaries, I no longer do, your body produces both testosterone and estrogen. And so, for most people, unlike me, everyone's body, basically people's bodies will produce both of these hormones in varying amounts. And so the idea that estradiol is the girl hormone and testosterone is the guy hormone is just not true. It doesn't match up with the psychology. It doesn't match up with how we understand gender. It doesn't understand up with the psychophysiology. It's not there. Don't do that. Don't talk about it that way. And kind of is another point here I really want to point out is that there is also a cursory amount of research implicating testosterone as playing a role in aggression. But this is, again, we talked about effect sizes with oxytocin. This one is also pretty overdone. It might be one of the most overdone connections between hormones and behavior that is around. People don't hulk out in response to taking testosterone supplements. It does have an effect on the body, but it's not going to make people much more aggressive or anything like that. The effect size or the size of that effect is massively overstated in pop psych. All right. So how do we understand moving the brain around? Or how do we understand visualizing the brain? Well, it started back in the 1800s with phrenology, where we looked at different, where phrenologists, famous for their calipers, would look at the bumps in a person's skull as a way of trying to understand what their personality might be. It did lead to some of our current ideas about brain structure over time, but it's horseshit. Phrenology isn't real. It comes back every now and then. People try to dress it up as if like, but it's stupid bioessentialism. The idea that like people with different brain shapes or different sized brains might have different properties. It's just not true. The science doesn't support it in any way. Now there is some, like I said, the idea of different areas of the brain being connected to different brain functions. That was a novel idea. It led to a lot of our current understanding, but everything else about phrenology basically sucks. And remember, like everything I talked about there's almost no area of the brain that is specific into one highly specialized function. Almost every area of the brain, every neuron is pulling double duty, triple duty, quadruple duty, 100-fold duty. Phrenology ain't real. I'm just going to keep saying it. Anyway. Our next great big milestone was the development of the EEG, or the electroencephalogram, where if you've ever seen an image of a person with different electrodes put onto their brain, what an EEG does is it records neural potentiation. And by looking at the different amounts of activity in the brain, people can tell based on the electrode what areas are active overall. So if you've ever seen the spindles and all of that, they're used a lot in sleep studies. Still actually used a lot in sleep studies. Typically what you're looking at is an EEG, or again, an electroencephalogram. Now, there's been a lot of progress on this over the years. So you might have heard of a CT scan, or a computed tomography scan, where multiple x-rays are stacked together to make a three-dimensional image of a person's brain. This is typically used to look at the structure of a brain. Maybe not necessarily function, but looking for different components, maybe if whether or not there's a suspicion of brain damage, or maybe even a tumor in the brain. CT scans can be used to identify something like that. fMRIs, or functional magnetic resonance imaging, or magnetic resonance imaging, or MRIs, are used to indirectly visualize brain structure. What these use, they operate by using magnets to chart the movement of iron in the blood in the brain. And so by looking at either iron in the blood, or in some cases, like with fMRI, sometimes blood oxygen levels, it's a way of indirectly indicating brain activity in something like this. So this is one of the funnier examples I can use that's actually very relevant. So this is what happens when you put a dead fish in an fMRI. So what you can see here is that there is some recorded neurological activity here, right? So this is what an fMRI will actually look like. Now there's a caveat here though, right? There is no activity. This fish is dead. So by looking at these indirect imaging techniques like fMRIs and MRIs, it opens up a whole new avenue of being able to see what different trajectories and use, like blood oxygen levels or iron or blood circulation levels, look like in the brain. And yet, we don't know whether or not those indirect measures are actually correlated to brain activity. So you can find blood moving around in the brain. You can find maybe some triggering impulses. You can find evidence of what we might think of as neural activity, but we don't really know whether or not the activity in those structures is actually neural activity. Does that make sense? Basically, fMRIs and MRIs are not the be-all, end-all of understanding how the brain works. And now there's also a very scary prospect here. Because remember, this is a dead fish that you're looking at here. Let's think about that for a second. What are the implications for the entire field of neuroscience that is built on data collected through fMRIs, if this is what you get here. You put a dead fish in an fMRI and you can get dots to light up. It's not looking good, right? Mm-hmm. You're not wrong. Oh, excuse me. I was rude and took a bite, like all good professors. Yeah, brain. That's that's one way to interpret it. You don't even need a brain. I don't have a brain. I'm just made of Photoshop layers. Now I'm doing fine. So, we've talked about brain lateralization before. And that is to say, you've got a left hemisphere and you've got a right hemisphere of your brain. Now, in pop psych, we talk a lot about how the left hemisphere tends to be more in charge of fine language skills, whereas the right hemisphere tends to be more about perception and facial perception. I think some cases will even say that the right brain is like the math and logic brain, and the left brain is like the arts and crafts brain. Now, I want to knock this as hard as I can. There is evidence that some brain functions do show evidence of lateralization, but that is massively overblown in pop psychology. Now, I talked about this in an earlier lecture in response to a question, but in some cases, the corpus callosum, which is the band of nerve fibers that connects and allows the two halves of the brain to communicate, will be severed. This is typically done in response to epilepsy and some other seizure disorders. And what will happen in those cases is that even when the brain has been severed, now in this case, so now no longer, you basically have two separate brains, left brain, right brain. They are no longer talking to each other. They have lost each other's phone. They have a mutual block on Twitter. Yet, the people that undergo this procedure are generally able to live very normal, productive, and functional lives. Now, if lateralization was the rule of was as extreme as people say it is, the fact that there's a breakdown of communication here not being that big of a deal is evidence against the significance of the left brain, right brain thesis, because they aren't that specialized. There's some evidence in some functions, but by and large, they can really fill in for each other, and they can take on a lot of each other's, like a lot of the functions that the other one might undergo. Now, in some cases, very extreme cases of epilepsy, maybe young, like especially in youth epilepsy, a doctor might recommend a procedure called a hemispherectomy, where one half of the brain is not only severed, but it is physically removed. And in those cases, if the procedure is done young enough through the wonders of neuroplasticity, the other half of the brain is able to pick up those functions over time. And so in some cases, again, like extreme cases of youth epilepsy, a doctor might remove an entire half of a person's brain, and they are able to go on to live a functional and normal life. Brains are wild. So I want to close out here going into the same, our last subject here. And no, it's wild, right? It once again blew my mind the first time I heard that there are people walking around perfectly functional, living perfectly normal lives, and they only have one half of a brain. Because again, it's all about the connections, right? And the neurons that they do still have can still form new connections and take on those functions of the neurons that were removed. Let's see, but do they like pina coladas? Everyone likes pina coladas. That's not even a question. I've yet to find anyone that does not like pina coladas. I have found people that don't like dancing in the rain, though. All right, quick crash course here. Let's talk about brains and the epigenetics of behavior. Turns out everyone's got chromosomes. The chromosomes are inside every cell. They carry a set of genes. Humans have 46 chromosomes. We get 23 from each parent. They're mixed together and they're used to pass on traits. Now, rarely errors in genes can occur, making them either more or less likely to be passed on, or what can occur in the transcription process. Usually, these are harmful, but in some rare cases, they are actually more beneficial, giving an organism a better chance to survive and pass on their genes. This is literally the underpinning of evolution. It is the change in the frequency of different alleles or chromosomes in a gene pool over time. That is really what evolution is. So adaptive mutations will slowly enter the gene pool and then over millions of years can create substantial changes in branches in a species. One case, since the Olympics are still on my brain, there was quite a controversy around Michael Phelps. Turns out Michael Phelps, world famous record-setting Olympic swimmer, turns out he actually has a genetic mutation that causes his muscles to tire out more slowly, and it allows him to train harder, really, than anyone of his contemporaries could possibly do. So, kind of cool stuff going on there with sort of an example of a contemporary and a popular adaptive mutation. So our brains have evolved over time through this function of evolution in the change in the frequency of alleles over time. So way back when, we shared a common ancestor with apes about 6 to 7 million years ago. And as you can see over time, since then, our brains have increased massively, with the greatest increases happening in the cerebral cortex. Even our closest evolutionary relative, the chimpanzee, has a substantially smaller brain, albeit structurally similar brain to us. But what is the implication for behavior and genetics? There is some attempt to try to look at maybe twin studies and other forms of genetic expression as an explanation for behavior. This is when we get into the nature versus nurture debate. That is to say, what percentage of traits can we explain via variation in genes between individuals? And we do know that some traits are highly heritable. If you have tall parents, you tend to have tall kids. And yet, certain other traits like personality traits or religious affiliations tend to be harder to inherit or more complicated. Now, there are different ways to look at these in terms of behavioral genetics: family studies, twin studies, adoption studies. So in a family study, you might look at the different personality traits and then take genetic samples from members of a family to see how much there is a correlation between certain maybe alleles being present in a person's genome and their behavior and personality traits. The same thing is true with twin studies, maybe looking at fraternal versus identical twins, as well as adoption studies, where if someone is given up for adoption before birth, where they have no genetic similarity to their adoptive parents who have raised them, you can kind of look at and see what are the similarities and differences there. It's a variety of ways to get at this question. But the core idea is to determine how genes and environment interact to produce particular traits. All right. Well, that's the end of chapter 3. I hope you guys had fun. I know this was a little bit short, or shorter. It's a very didactic chapter. Like I said, it's not my favorite to teach. Also, wasn't my favorite as a student, if I'm going to be very honest. But we all survived. And the next time we meet, we're going to be talking about sensation and perception, which is the chapter that we get to talk about all the fun illusions and illusions. It's going to be, it's also a lot more fun to teach. We get to talk about differences in how we perceive the world, talk about how our brains function, and all kinds of cool stuff, right? It's going to be fun. All right. Well, thank you again for joining for class. I'm going to hang out for a little bit of a QA afterwards, but if you're watching on YouTube, this is where the ride ends. Hopefully I'll see you next time I do one of these. Bye!